Short people got problems, what can I say? Alright, so everybody, we think of the captains of industry as being the lone genius who sits in a room all day and thinks, and all of a sudden they get a light bulb idea and they're doing it all by themselves. But that's not actually how it works. Those people, such as Thomas Edison, had an entire lab, an entire staff of people making all those light bulb prototypes, so they found the kind that worked. We had these people have families, they have staffs, they have peers in the field who, if anything, are contributing research about what does not work. So the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss actually built airplanes that flew, but there were many before them that built some that did not fly, and that contributed to the research about what would work. So today I am going to be talking to all of you fine folks about early synthesizers, about Bob Moog versus Don Buchla. So they were definitely pioneers in the field, but they built on the shoulders of some of the people who came before them. The people who came before them were experimenting with electronic music using test equipment that was used to calibrate tape machines and radio equipment, and that they were using the earliest oscillators. So oscillator is a fancy word that means an electronic circuit that creates a sound wave. Now, we're only going to talk about two of the waveforms today because we have limited time. The first one I'd like to talk to you about is the sawtooth wave. You can see how it slowly ramps up and then falls straight down. Now, this is a very common sound, and people who create electronic music often like to start with a sawtooth wave because it has so much rich content in it. And this is the general sound of what a sawtooth wave sounds like. A little bit of delay added for effect, but you get the point. Okay, cool. The next waveform is a square wave. Now, it's called a square wave when it rises above the line and then falls back below it. We can have pulse waves that only rise above and do not fall down below the line. And we can have wide and narrow waves, and the tone quality will change drastically based on how wide or narrow it is, but for the purpose of time, let's talk about a very simple symmetrical square wave. Those of you that grew up playing early video games will very much recognize this one because game consoles, before you could play actual acoustic audio, they had zeros and ones instructing a little onboard synthesizer what to play. That sound familiar? You won! Okay, now one other general thing I want to point out before I start talking about the difference between Bob Moog and Don Buchla's approach. This is another thing that they both have in common. We have envelopes. Envelope means changing something over time. Most often, envelopes are used to change the volume of a sound over time. So most sounds coming from a synthesizer rise out of silence when you press a key and fall back into silence when you release the key. And the envelope determines the shape at which it does that. So if you look at the top left of this slide, you're going to see a long, sloping mountain lake at the top left, which is this first one that we're going to hear. This is a lush string pad. Which is very staccato, very pointy, very short. All right, guess I should have quantized that, but that shows you how the envelope shapes can be different depending on what you're going for. Okay, so East Coast synthesis is also known as subtractive synthesis, is also known as promulgated by Bob Moog, Anton Perlman, and others in his camp. You can see at the bottom of this slide that across the bottom there is a very, very, very basic diagram of an oscillator feeding into a filter, feeding into a VCA, a voltage-controlled amplifier, and feeding down from the top to control two of those things is contour generator, which is really just an envelope. So that is a representation of how it goes together. I want to bring your attention to Suzanne Ciani, I want to bring your attention to Wendy Carlos, who was a pioneering electronic musician that worked very closely with Bob Moog to design and refine the earliest modular synthesizers. And Wendy Carlos composed and recorded the famous Switched on Bach albums, which you may be familiar with. She was also the very first openly transgender woman in the field. Unfortunately, she was not out until later in life, but hats off to her for being who she is and doing what she does, and I do believe she's still alive today. Now that we're talking about East Coast subtractive synthesis and Bob Moog, this slide is showing you what a filter does. We call it subtractive synthesis because we're literally taking away a large chunk of the original sound that is there in order to give us a new character. It's a bit like giving a sculptor a hunk of marble and the sculptor takes away everything that isn't the figure that they want to make. So think of this, if there's any audio nerds in the house, like an EQ on any mixing console or outboard gear, or even like your car stereo, you have the tone controls. So this is a low pass filter, which literally allows the low frequencies to pass, and the sliding down at the right side is the amount at which the higher frequencies are turned down. And a little bump in the center, right where the cutoff is, that bump, there is a little extra adding of sound right where the cutoff is, and we're going to call that resonance. So the first example that you're going to hear is a little ditty while I turn down the cutoff frequency on the filter so you can hear the sound get darker. And then we're going to hear that same ditty again, but with the resonance turned all the way up, so you can really hear the color that it adds. So you hear it getting darker. Now here it is with the resonance. Okay, and now we're going to hear something tricky. Coming to my planet soul. Who remembers that song? So that last example, that Planet Soul bass line, that was using an envelope to modulate the filter, so you get a little of that resonance, but yeah, I hope I'm making sense here. Okay, and I like to draw too, and I come out with some trippy drawings that look like sounds and such. So next I would like to talk a little about modulation. In this model, one of the main ways that we make things change over time is by using an LFO, or a low frequency oscillator, to modulate or change stuff over time. If it's done really quickly, it can create a textured effect. If it's done really slowly, it can kind of create a cycling pattern of like a tide or a wave. Now, we'll hear a couple different examples here. The first one is like a classic lead, and I'm going to be bringing in some vibrato, which is created by basically using a triangle wave to modulate the pitch of the oscillator. So it sounds like a violinist moving their fingers on the strings. Then we are going to hear a whoop, 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 whoop sound of modulating the cutoff frequency of the filter with the resonance turned up. So first, here's the vibrato. There it is. Okay, now we get the side-by here. Now it gets real tricky. A spaceship has landed. Okay, so that is the East Coast subtractive model. Okay, thank you. I am going to speed through this real quick. So this is Don Buchla. I would like to say is a little bit like a competitor, but not really, because I want to believe it was all done in the spirit of camaraderie. Buchla had a completely different approach to synthesis. Rather than using a filter to shape the tone color so dramatically, like you just heard, he used other methods. While I'm on this slide, I just want to highlight Suzanne Ciani, who also worked very, very closely with Don Buchla and kind of studied under him and helped him build his instruments and created a ton of music. If you all know the 7 Waves or the Velocity of Love, those are her quote-unquote tamer titles, but she really goes way out there with some of it using her actual Buchla modular. So this method called frequency modulation, or FM, was pioneered by John Chowning, but Buchla used it a lot in his instruments, and like you heard with the LFOs a second ago, we could hear the ebb and flow of the tone color. But with frequency modulation, that LFO is turned back up to audio level. So I don't know if I have time to really go all into the mechanics of it, but suffice it to say that the textured effect is so fast, you cannot hear the ebb and flow of the change. It just creates whole new frequencies because it is going so fast. So the depth or the amount of FM modulation makes it sound very metallic, and the pitch makes it either sound very harmonic and nice or very harsh and not nice. So you're first going to hear me basically turning up the FM depth, and then you're going to hear me messing around with the pitch, and then you're going to hear a nice little bell to show that FM can make wonderful bell sounds. So here's the depth. Hear how it gets kind of harsh? And here is the pitch. It goes, Christmas never left us. And last but not least, I want to talk a little about wave folding, which is another of Buchla's effects that he used to get different timbres. And again, audio geeks in the room will understand that when you crank up a signal too high on anything, it clips and distorts because the tops and the bottoms of the waveforms are getting chopped off. Wave folding is a little bit different in that instead of just getting chopped off, it turns around and changes direction and goes back down. So with enough of that coming to the top, turning around, with all of that going on, you get all new frequencies. Now, this I don't know very much about, but the sounds I was getting were not terribly interesting. So it gets metallic-y and tangy. It does get harsher the more you increase the effect, but I didn't know how that would translate on the system, and I didn't want to be unkind to y'all's ears. So, yay, I got through all my slides. And and this is one of my drawings, which I hope to put on stuff someday.
So cute.
Gee, I wonder why.
Next, you're next. So in the front we have, why haven't we heard about these women before?
Well, I think it's a case of our media. They are not focused on. There are so many other men that get so much airtime. I mean, we love you guys, but I just don't think that the industry focuses enough on their work because of gender discrimination, and it's the industry is kind of a boys' club at times.
That's changing.
Yeah.
Who's next?
So, distortion pedals and effects pedals and so forth that guitarists use in concert, are those just synthesizers?
That's a good question. So distortion pedals and effects pedals, they are using specific circuits to create just that effect and applying that effect to whatever acoustic instrument, like your guitar, you're putting through the pedal. Did you ask if you could use them with synthesizers?
Well, I'm just asking if it's essentially the same thing as a synthesizer.
Not exactly, because with a synthesizer you are starting from nothing basically, and you're using a circuit to create a sound, versus with an effects pedal, you're putting an acoustic instrument into it and you're applying that effect on top of the sound of an acoustic instrument. And if you didn't have an instrument going through it, you probably wouldn't hear any sound, except for a little yeah.
Over here.
How have computers changed synthetic music since the first ones were basically, basic circuits? Now do computers just mimic those things?
Yeah, so you're asking how have computers changed synthesis, and how are they different from the older ones? And that is a whole can of worms. So the short answer is there's two camps. They can either very much emulate the older ones. Their Cherry Audio and Arturia have amazing clones of classics like the Mini Moog and the ARP 2600 and different other ones. Or they can do completely new things and go completely in totally new directions. So there's programs that do things like granular synthesis, which is taking a tiny little sliver and repeating it hundreds of thousands of times and making new textures with it and various things like that. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
In the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, and the picture you showed in the one of the switched on box person, it looks like they're in a telephone operator board. What are all those wires and knobs and what's going on there?
Excellent question. So Wendy Carlos sort of looked like a telephone operator booth. So that is called a modular synthesizer. So that means that the earliest models had oscillators and filters and envelopes and other types of circuits in their very own discrete panels, and you had to use patch cables to connect them together. So you'd have to patch the output from an oscillator into a mixer, into a filter, and patch an envelope or another oscillator in to modulate them. But when you got to the stage where you had keyboard synthesizers that were pre-patched, like the Mini Moog or the Prophet 5, all that stuff was hardwired already behind the user panel. And it was not as flexible, but yet it was a whole lot more streamlined, and gigging musicians could do a lot more with it because they weren't having to wrangle all these patch cables. And there was pretty much a pattern that gigging musicians wanted, and so that's what they made when they started making keyboard synthesizers. But yeah, you can really go wild and do some wacky stuff when you're patching a modular. Any other questions?
Was the first sound synthesizer based on analog or digital computers?
Analog. So the very first from the 60s, they had circuits that made analog waves, and then digital audio from computers didn't start coming in until about the 80s, I think. When they started making digital keyboards, the DX7 was an early one that could use FM and other digital methods. The M1 was the digital one, and their heyday was the 80s, definitely. Okay, thank you very much. Following for future stuff to happen in the future. Thank you.